I just thinking, I didn't really realize that. I got to thinking, I've been here 6 times. Twice Dick has booked me on the first day of April Fool's Day. And this time he booked me on Friday the 13th. I think I think that's character assassination by association or something. That ought to be worth $750,000. So at any rate, well, it is whatever it is. St. Patrick's Day, right? It's coming out. Yeah. One of my favorite, because I have a couple Irish jokes, and the only time I tell them is the week preceding here. And I guess maybe I've told them before, but I write things down so that I won't tell you the same joke, but because I forget what I tell you. But my chairman one time, he looked at my audience, he said, they probably wouldn't remember anyway. So, I don't know. But anyway, this is a story, an Irish story, about a couple Irishmen, Pat and Mike, and they lived in a very peaceful town in Ireland, way back in the Irish Hills. It was so far back, there was nothing in back of it. I mean, if you went any farther in, you were coming out, I guess. I didn't get June bugs till the middle of August. This is a very quiet town. But they left that peaceful setting and they came to New York on a ship, and they got into they docked, and they got off and they walked up Manhattan Island until they came to the first major cross street, and there was so much traffic they were intimidated, and they didn't even try crossing. They went down to the corner, big Irish cop, and they told him they just got in from Ireland. And they said, how do you cross the street in your country without getting killed? Well, fellas, he said, here we have traffic lights. And he said, that red light you see over the street is one of them. And he said, you watch, and pretty soon it'll turn green. And when it does, that's your turn to go. So they watched it, and pretty soon it turned green, all right. And the traffic all quit, and they immediately fell in love with New York, because to this particular two Irishmen, that particular shade of green was the prettiest color in the world. So they walked across in fine shape. They get on the other side. Pat looked over his shoulder just as the light went from green to orange for 4 seconds, and then to red. Begorra, Mike, he said, they don't give those Protestants much time to cross. Yeah. And there's a story about there were three fellows in the British Isles. There was an Englishman named Bentley, a Scotsman named McGregor, and an Irishman named Murphy, of course. And they were going to the Olympic Games that were being held that year in Europe. Indeed, they did go, and they went together. But when they got there, they were all sold out. There were no tickets left, and quite a crowd were milling around the big gate there. And there was a wall around this place, and the Englishman looked down the wall, and he saw another gate, a very little unpretentious gate, but occasionally somebody went in, and he went down and watched it. It was a gate the contestants came in and out of, and he watched how they operated. They'd come up, they gave their name, their nationality, and their event, and they let them in. So he looked around, he found a pole laying alongside the wall. He put it on his shoulder, he marched up to that gate, and he said, Bentley, England, pole vault. Son of a gun. They opened the door, and in he went. So McGregor, the Scotsman, looked around and finally found a manhole cover, and he pried that sucker loose, and he staggered up to the gate. He says, McGregor, Scotland, discus. And in he went. Well, poor old Murphy's out there all by himself now. He looked, and all he could find was a roll of barbed wire. So he put it on his arm, and he walked up to the gate. He said, Murphy, Ireland, fencing. So, well, we're going to Montana tonight, and I like this film because it takes me home every day. I live there. I was born there. I've told you all that. Born in the house. I live in the house I was born in today. and it's a valley in the Rocky Mountains, western Montana. Little town close to us called Deborgia, and it's a nothing town. It's located right at the intersection of two dead-end streets. I think our location has hurt us. Something has hurt us. I know that. We have never done nothing. There's just nothing ever. They're going to change, some changes. They're going to change the roller towel down at the bus at the bus depot. But finally, the main road does go through it now, and they have a sign telling you, announcing. First time we've ever had a sign. It's simple enough. It says entering Devorgia. It says the same thing on the other side, because you're not there that long. But it's a kind of a quiet, peaceful. We don't have any crime in the streets. Actually, we got plenty of crime. We just don't have any streets. But at any rate, that's why I live there. Because you don't, when you're born, you don't even know where you are, and you don't have any contacts. I was 19 before I learned about Idaho. It's only 20 miles, but we didn't travel much. Born right in the middle of the Depression, yes, I was. And I got to thinking the other day, driving along, and I thought that everybody in my hometown was born there. Yeah, I think. I mean, what I'm saying there is that nobody ever moved there. I mean, they're all. Well, we have one family, we call them the new folks, but they weren't born there, but they didn't really move there either. It's more of a, I don't know, they came during the 30s. They've been there quite a while, but it was the Depression, and he lived in Minnesota, and he thought he had a job in Oregon. And they were driving to Oregon, and the car broke down right in the middle of our little town. So, and they're still, I guess, waiting for parts. I don't know what to... Well, we don't talk to new people too much. Hard to get a transmission for a Durant anymore. But at any rate, and my grandpa picked it out, and Grandpa came out of Kentucky, and near a town called Hazard, and I'm not pulling your leg, there is a Hazard, Kentucky. It's in the eastern part, quite mountainous, farming, not good farming, but little farms and mining. Grandpa had a farm, he said, 40 acres on a mountainside, and raised corn, and dabbled in chemistry. He bottled the entire 40 acres as near as I can tell. And he left that and he came west in a covered wagon, my grandpa, literally in a covered wagon. And if you'd see what he looked like, you'd know why they covered the wagon. He looked like 5 miles of bad road, he did. And that's where he peaked out. He went down from there. I mean, he came west right after the Civil War. And the Indian Wars and he became well known up in that area as an old Indian fighter, primarily because he would only fight old Indians. And the young ones fought like tigers. He wanted no part of that. And that's when he settled. He settled in the valley that I'll show you tonight. Crazy old nut. He left Kentucky. He said it was too mountainous, and he settled in a place that's twice as bad. And in between, he crossed Iowa with my aching back. I mean, anybody looking for farmland crosses Iowa. He hasn't got both oars in the water either. I mean, he's a nice old guy, but his elevator was stuck in the basement for sure. I mean, really. But that's when he settled there in Deborgia, and then he just went to pot. He did. I don't know. He lost a leg in the Indian Wars, lost an arm in a logging accident. A lot of stuff went wrong. He lost a horse kicked him in the head, knocked an eye out. He got in a fight with a guy, and the guy knocked his teeth out. His hair fell out, all by itself, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, when he finally died, one of our neighbors sent us a sympathy card. It said, "We're sorry to hear you lost the rest of your grandpa." So well, I don't even know what he died of, but nothing serious, I guess. He lived to be 92. 92, he told me just before he died, he said if he knowed he's going to live so long, He'd have taken better care of himself. You know? So, we're going to talk about Lewis and Clark tonight. Lewis and Clark are very much involved in the history of Montana. And in 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased from France the great center section of our nation. Remember this, some of you my age will remember from a long time ago, reading about the Louisiana Purchase. Well, that's what Jefferson bought from Napoleon of France for $15 million. And it's a huge area, the breadbasket of our nation. And it ran from, the title on it was very indefinite. It ran from New Orleans, the mouth of the Mississippi, to the longest tributary of that river system. So Lewis and Clark were sent out by President Jefferson to find the longest tributary of the Mississippi-Missouri system and to claim everything from there, wherever there might be, to New Orleans by right of purchase. Then he said, when you find that headwater, wherever, he said, then you can come home. You'll be welcomed as heroes. But he said, remember, this nation desperately needs a route on west past that headwater, through the great mountains we hear about, to the Western Sea. He said, unless we establish a route to and a claim to the Pacific shore, Russia will ultimately own it. So they had two jobs, really. So we'll be talking, if you want to turn out the lights, so go. I'm going with my brother Dennis. I have a brother named Dennis who's an only child. But at any rate, we'll be talking about the state you see, Montana. And here's an interesting little piece of information that probably you'll never have any use for. More people go from east to west through Montana than from west to east, and always have. In the early days, it made sense, because, you know, they came from the populated east to the open spaces in the west. But also the rivers ran east and west. And so travel did, because the rivers were the highways. But now we have highways whichever direction, but they still go more west and go east. Now, there was an exception to that, and that was the Spanish. The Spanish, the earliest Caucasians to come to this land, came from the south, old Mexico, coming north looking for the 7 golden cities of Cibola. Remember we talked about that one time, Coronado? Well, Coronado, on that expedition, gave us our name in Montana. He came into Wyoming, Montana, saw the mountains, gave it the Spanish word for mountains, Montaña. We corrupted it to Montana. But on that same trip, it was in August of 1544, he wrote in his diary, the local natives, he said, call their land the land of the shining mountain. Those of us that live where we do in the Rockies like the old Indian name very much. Now, it's a long state, though. Now, the Sioux Indians lived in the Great Plains in the east. They saw a totally different world and had a totally different name. They called this land the land of the big sky. Wheat is our biggest growing crop, and it's I tell you, any state that outlaws gambling should not allow farming. It's the biggest gamble in the world. Well, they talk about the big-time gamblers in Las Vegas. They're a bunch of wimps. I mean, you want to see a real gambler talk to a dryland wheat farmer. Depends entirely on the elements. And it can go without, you know, it can go without rain. I mean, some of you remember the Dust Bowl, the 30s, a great drought. Years. Folks, we had frogs 5 years old that didn't even know how to swim. I mean, it was really dry. And a lot of the land just blew away in dust clouds. But we never lost our sense of humor. Americans are famous for that, I tell you. When things get toughest, they tell a happy, funny, sad story about an old wheat farmer that came to the bank in Great Falls in those hard, dry years. Wanted to borrow money to buy seed. He was going to try it again. And the banker told him, John, he said, before I loan you the money, I'll have to drive out and look over your land. Just then, the old fellow looked out the window of the bank, saw a great cloud of dust billowing towards them. Never mind driving out, he said. Here it comes now. And the land blew to the east, the westerly winds, and they had another little sad saying. Some of them gave up and went back east. And the people would say, well, why did you come back east? And they would say, following the farm. This man was a cattleman. He's got 5,000 head of cattle, many of which would drink out of. This was a lovely little lake. It's not snow, folks. The water is dehydrated in the drought and left the alkali. That's alkali. So he's still got 5,000 head of cattle and no place to drink. Farming is filled with hazards, none of which you control. Now, between the east and the west, lie a different range of mountains. In the vernacular of our times, a kinder, gentler range. And you get off the main road. Now we have country roads that are often, we call winding. Tourists call them crooked. This was surveyed by a surveyor that followed the trail of a lovesick moose. And in the central mountains, we have our state flower. The Montana state flower is called the bitterroot, and most Montanans have never seen one. They grow in very remote areas and in very sparse numbers normally. But they got their name from the Indians. The Indians ate the root, which had a heavy quinine content, and that caused it to be bitter, and that's where they got the name bitterroot. And they ate it for the same reason we would use quinine, to lower fevers, cure headaches. And in the second reel, for those of you that do not sneak off at halftime, I'll tell you a pretty story about a beautiful girl, Sacagawea, and the bitterroot flower. Now, the buffalo never went to the Rockies. They came right to the foothills of the Rockies. But they never went into the Rocky Mountains, but they covered from the foothills to the east here, all the way to Pennsylvania, and numbered 30 million strong when the Caucasian first came. And where the buffalo were, the Indian were, for their lives were much interwoven. And they used to pound the root of this flower, the balsam root, with buffalo meat. It was one form of pemmican. It was a very fibrous root and a high fiber diet. And when the Caucasian first came to the Indian world, heart disease was totally unknown. A lot of people ask me about weather. We have 4 seasons. Fall, I think, is our prettiest. We do not have the red trees like they have in the Midwest and East. Have you ever been back there in the sugar maple? It just blow your socks off. We don't have red trees. We have red berries, kinnikinnick. And Mom used to boil the leaf, and we put it as a poultice on Dennis and I and Dad. We were loggers and always getting beat up and banged around. A pretty time to go is fall, though, because you get the fresh snow of the year, on the higher mountains, the Rockies, and you're getting now the fall color. Indian summer, last week in September, first 3 weeks in October. But winter comes. Notice the last line. The temperature dropped to 70 degrees below zero. It's the coldest recorded spot in the continental United States, not far from where we live. And folks, that was not 70-degree wind chill. That's just flat out 70 degrees below zero. Like Mark Twain said, if the thermometer had been 2 inches longer, we'd have all froze to death. And Dennis and I grew up, and we manufactured one of our games. We had an icicle growing contest, and we always see how the prettiest frost flowers. These are frost flowers, Mom called them. We had single pane windows. We don't now. But single pane in a cold house, you have those flowers every morning. And the interesting thing, they were always different. Even on the same window, we'd have different flowers in the morning. And of course, things now, machinery has bettered our quality of life, I guess. I'm not sure. Everybody has one of these in the towns. Everybody keeps their driveway clear with little ones. But what you do is you throw it on your neighbor's driveway. And what he does is throw it onto your driveway. We have snow that falls in November that hasn't landed by the middle of January. I mean, it's just... But the thing is, this is not a bad day. It's not a crisis. It's just a typical downtown DeBorgia Street scene on a wintry day. Yeah. It's my brother Dennis. My brother Dennis coming over to my house to borrow a cup of sugar. I mean, he knocked on the door one day. I opened up. My brother was standing there. He had a handful of sugar, and he wanted to borrow a cup. And I started crying out loud. He couldn't even get that straight. When spring comes, and in a hard winter country, spring is doubly welcome. The flowers just jump out, and our friends, our neighbors start coming back from the south where they've wintered. Among them, the little ruby-throat hummingbird. And he comes back, and he attracts a mate, and that's what he's doing. It's kind of a Lonely Hearts column. He sends out messages with that lovely red, and it's not the sun reflecting off his neck. First few times I saw it, I thought it was. Then I saw him in the shade, it's still there, and I saw him one night, it was so dark you could scarcely see the bird, just like a great red flash in the night. This is an iridescence, a luminescence that radiates from within. And that was the ruby throat, this is the gold throat. And it does work. They attract a mate, and the young ones come along. If you really want your money's worth, buy a hummingbird feeder. It's an ongoing source of joy all year, or all through the summer months. The little green ones are the babies, yeah. And another family that comes back, the red-tailed flicker. Now, my dad and my grandpa felled this tree. They were loggers. About the time I was born, as I understand. And as it began to decay, the red-tailed flicker family took it over. And Mom used to say, they're always the same family, and they always come back on the 17th day of April. Well, I don't know that, but it was an exciting thing to watch for. And last year, bluebird came again. When I was little, they were always there. They disappeared for 50 years. This was truly the bluebird of happiness. Just look at the color. I tell you, when I look at birds sometime, I don't believe what I'm looking at. I mean, it's just so pretty, and the lovely sight of the geese walking north in the spring. Some of the old timers, well, I can remember when the geese used to fly north in the spring. The air got so polluted they gave up on that. But I mean, it's a long walk for the little ones. They got short legs, and it's a lot of goose steps, I'll tell you. And they get late they get up there so late, it's already turned cold. They just turn around and come back. Because geese get cold, when geese get cold, they get people bumps. Well, these are the Rockies, and that snowfield is 200 feet thick. You see, the Rockies are more than a scenic attraction. They're the birthplace of many rivers. Drops of water giving birth to a river here. And the peaks of the Rockies can eventually irrigate a cotton field in Louisiana, 2,500 miles away. And thousands of acres of corn as it goes down along the edge of Iowa and Nebraska, and wheat as it crosses eastern Montana and the Dakotas. It also turns turbines that produce electricity, megawatts, that send power to 28 of our states created by Montana water. The mountains, therefore, are more than a scenic attraction. In their cold upper heights, they hold back the melting snow of spring that releases it more evenly. It helps to cut down on the floods of spring, and it guarantees you a certain reservoir of water in the late, thirsty months of the summer. And another thing our water has done, water created in the Rockies, the rivers thus formed were the highways for the early people, and even yet today, incredible tonnages travels on our water highways. And the littler rivers got into bigger rivers and formed great interstates. Like in Montana, we have a major river, the Missouri. And this river was used by the Indians for hundreds of years, a major highway for the native people for hundreds of years before we came. Now, the rivers not only gave us a highway to travel to the western frontier, but they gave the people a reason for going there, because the same rivers that they traveled on were the habitat of the beaver, and the beaver fur was the biggest cash crop of the American West for many years. We're going to look at a map now of North America in 1802. You'll notice that the United States is entirely east of the Mississippi River. That was all we were, folks, for many years. Spain owned the South. Notice the northwest corner. This worried President Jefferson. Russia, Britain, France, and us all claimed it. That really worried him. So he bought the center section from Napoleon, the Louisiana Purchase. And then in 1804, he sent Lewis and Clark out with two objectives: find the head of the Missouri and claim all between there and New Orleans by right of purchase, and then, if possible, go on and find a route and a claim to the western seacoast. Now, he told them, don't go up the big river that goes north, that goes to Canadian British territory. Turn off at the little town of St. Louis and take the northwest river we call the Missouri, because that one read right up in the spring of 1805. They come to what is now the Montana, and look how close that led him to the northwest corner. He was right at the back door of the land that worried him most. Well, the earliest Caucasians had come, and we all realize that we did not discover the land. The land had been lived in by reasoning, thinking people for hundreds of years, the American natives or Indians. But the first Caucasians that came were kind of a grab the money and run philosophy. They were after the fur, the gold, sometimes just the adventure. They came in the spring when the weather got pretty decent, and they left in the fall when it started to get bad. They did not put down roots. The first came and settled were called just that, for settlers, and that's why they were called that. These were the first to come and have the guts to stop in the middle of nowhere in a hard, distant, solitary, and truly often dangerous land and say, this is my home and I'm going to stay here. These are the ones. And this group had an element that no previous group had had. And that element, folks, was women. Women were the strength. Women were the glue that held the American Western frontier together. When my family came, Matthew, who was with me tonight, I broke him in on, other way, honey, I've told you many times. I broke him in on the camera, hoping someday he might take over. So when they had this great cattle drive, I just gave him the whole outfit. I said, honey, shoot anything that suits your fancy. And boy, we couldn't wait, my wife and I, and were we ever dismayed. I tell you, what shoots a kid's fancy nowadays is just so ridiculous. I mean, Ruth cried for 2 weeks. She said, where did we go wrong? Well, I don't know. There's so many curves in parenting that which one we missed, it's hard to tell, you know. Well, folks, this wagon train is part of our 100th birthday centennial. Montana was 100 years old as a state in 1889. We had many events, but two major attractions. The Great Wagon Train, and in the second reel, the last of the cattle calls, the last great cattle drive, over 3,000 head of cattle. And notice we're going across open range. Once in a while we're on roads, but a lot of it was just like the old timers did, as near as you could reproduce it today. But I've often thought about it, you know, at night they would have to stop by water, just like they did in the old days too. But we have to remember that the people that came on the cattle trains, folks, were not homeless people back east. They were fairly well off. They were middle class. My grandmother came as a 10-year-old girl, and she had lived in Galesburg, Illinois. The house had running hot and cold water and bathrooms and electric lights and a church across the road and a hospital 4 blocks away and loved ones and friends and grandparents. Magnificent, aren't they, the horse? Now, see, the wagons were kind of an early RV, very small, and they did their cooking on the outside. That's a very authentic one there. And a board lowered down, and the women did their cooking there. And these two little girls, I couldn't help but think of grandmother. Grandmother said the toughest decision was a decision to go, you can imagine. But the next toughest was what you would take. Or really, the toughest was what you would leave. Because anything you left, you never saw again, and they all kind of knew it. She was allowed to take one toy. She took a rag doll, which she talked to all the way. That's our Montana brand, M89. No, it isn't either, excuse me. Which she talked to that rag doll all the way across all those many weeks, and which she had till the day she died. So it was quite an event in their lives, believe me. And they did have a welder along. That's cheating a little. But on the old wagon train, folks, they all had a blacksmith. They had a qualified blacksmith in order to go. I see why the men went, you know, adventure, the machismo, hunting, fishing, that type of thing. But what I don't see, I mean, the women, it offered so little to a woman. You took everything that you would ever have of your prized possessions, put it in a 4x12 wagon box. Nobody had promised them a rose garden. They weren't going to a town or a settlement or a villa overlooking the Pacific. They were going to a mud hut in Nebraska. Maybe not even another mud hut there. They homesteaded in the most vacant spots, or a log cabin in the Rockies, you know, and they left behind. They went and they gave birth to children with no doctor, no medicine, no mother to say, here, Grandma, you know, I mean, I think the men went for the love of adventure. I think their wives went because of the love for their men. But women, emotionally, women are stronger than men. And you men know that too. I think the women do too, probably. Huh? Well, my dad was a logger, 6'6", 260 pounds, harder than a 10-minute egg. My mom was a little tiny thing. But when things really got really tough, Dad leaned on Mom. And she never buckled. They were hard, they were tough. Remember one time my dad was shingling the roof in the old 2-story house, and very foggy. In fact, it was so foggy, he had shingled out, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet beyond the edge. The wind came up, blew the fog out, and down he came. He landed right in front of me, just shook the earth, you know. And I ran in the house. Mom was sitting in the rocking chair peeling apples, looking out the window. I yelling my head up, Mom, I said, the old man just fell off the roof. She didn't even look up, you know. Yes, she said, I saw him go past the window. I ran out to Dad. He was coming around. Dad, I said, what happened? He said, I don't know. He said, I just got here myself. That's the Conestoga wagon. They were built in the Conestoga Valley of Pennsylvania. They were a freight wagon. They were bigger. But the average wagon, folks, 4 by 12 feet. Smaller than most bathrooms, you know. And that's where you put all your possessions and started out into a pretty much unknown world. And you started out with the knowledge that if you had trouble and broke down, you were on your own. Because if they waited for you, the winter would catch them before they crossed the mountains, as we have not far from here. Classic story of the Donner Party. Well, this trail was the Yellowstone Trail that ran to Montana. So when they saw the Rockies, they were not dismayed. They knew they were not going to cross through them, and they were not. Because the trail here ended here. If you wanted to go on to Oregon, you took the Oregon Trail to the south. Grandpa, however, went into the Rockies here. And this is where he settled. And that's the homestead you see there. And that's the valley where I was born and raised. My dad was born and raised. Dennis and I were born and raised. Our children were born and being raised. And it's a valley in what they call the Bitterroot Range of the Rocky Mountains. We don't have a big, well, we have Flathead Lake, but that's 100 miles away. But we have many little mountain lakes way up near the top of the mountains, and then these waterfalls drain those lakes down into the valley, and then a river runs down the valley. And this river is well carved into my memory, because we didn't have any toys. None of the kids did, though. I mean, it was hard times. We used to get food packages from Bangladesh. I mean, we had nothing, you know. So we manufactured our equipment with a few old dead logs tied together with barbed wire, and we floated the river many times, my brother and I. And we also caught fish out of it, because eating was a problem, and we ate a lot of fish in those days of the Depression. So the river's been a source of food and a source of fun. And my brother Dennis this is my sister-in-law, who also was raised on a homestead, a very down-to-earth childhood, and still raises a lot of their food. People that were born in the Depression are very food conscious. I mean, sometimes we don't get all we want now, but food was a big item then. So she raises potatoes on it's their garden here, and also flowers in the vegetable garden. And I have a flower garden too, in a stump. And here again, my grandpa felled the stump many years ago, and as it rotted out in more recent years, I planted a flower garden in the mulch. It creates kind of a mulch, but I sweetened it with something I bought in a sack in the hardware store. It does better. But anyway, and this then is that's down. Oh, and our homesteader rose. I forgot that. My grandmother planted this rose before I was born, right where it still grows. We call it homesteader rose because it had to be just as tough as a homesteader. Every winter it got flattened by snow and frozen with the cold, and every spring it had what it took to try it again. A homesteader rose, over 70 years old, yeah. And then I got married, my family came, and with both my grandpa and my brother being kind of upstairs and to the left, I worried about my kid. So I gave him that old intelligence test, you know, where's your mouth? No, I told you, that's crying out loud. Your mouth, honey. Poor little guy didn't know his left foot from his elbow. I mean, so I thought, well, what the heck, someday he'll make a great football player. And what the heck, someday he did. I had to wait a while, but this is 2 years ago when he graduated from high school. He made the Montana All-Star team. We're very, very proud of him. My littlest boy is going to be a great baseball player, but not right away. We've always been kind of a halfway house. These little characters are Mike and Ike, the little cub bears, and their mother was killed, and the game warden brought them to us because they're too little to leave alone in the forest. A cat, cougar, mountain lion, even the coyotes will get them, or their own dad. The male bear is a very poor parent, believe me. And without the mother to protect them, they're goners. So we keep them then, and they stayed with us over 6 weeks. We kept them outside in a crib mostly. Mom was always careful when we were little. Of course, she's gone long before this, but when we were little, we always had little things. She never let us make pets. She just said, you're giving birth to a heartbreak if you make a pet. And they would leave, and they would come back, and each day stay a little longer. And one day they left, and that's the last we saw of them. And not long after that, a farmer was plowing a field, plowed right through a badger den. and the mother and the siblings were killed. This little guy was all right, so he stayed with us for a month or so till he got squared away. And we always had baby deer, always. I don't remember a summer that we wouldn't see mother deer get killed, some on the road, on the railroad, and some by poachers, and when the ones are too little. So we'd find them in the woods, but Dad would never let us touch them for 3 days because he said their mother may cache them there. But after 3 days, if you don't take them, they can't last another one. So we took them home, and this is our dog, Patches, yeah. And the friendliest little wild thing we ever had was a real little socialite. She wanted to be everybody's friend, and nobody wanted anything to do with her. It was sad. She was the only thing there that didn't know she was a skunk. Everybody else did. And this is where I went to school, Dennis and I both, and my grandpa helped to build it. It was the first school in that part of western Montana. And then he married the first teacher that came to teach in it. Really, that was my grandmother, the one that came on the wagon train. And this is the trail. Dennis and I used to walk to school, 3 miles to school, uphill, both ways. My brother picked out the route. He's good at that. And many a morning, we'd go back to school, and our tracks from the night before would be covered with animal track, cougar, coyote, mountain lion, and nothing ever bothered us. Isn't that nice, really? They would track us. We'd see where they follow us a ways, but they never really, we worried once in a while, and many a times we'd see these are a ptarmigan, willow ptarmigan. In the summer, they're red and brown. In the winter, when the snow comes, they get a brand new winter outfit to blend with that snow. Yeah, we saw a lot of those. And every morning in those hungry years, my dad, and I would be like only 10 years old, Dad would give me the 30-30 and one lousy bullet to bring back something to eat the next day. One crummy bullet. I'll never get over that. Yeah, one morning I'd go into school, and I saw 10 of those ptarmigan, and they were all perched on a limb. And they were about maybe 3/4 of a mile away, but I only had the one bullet. So I took careful aim and I split the limb with it. And when it flew back together, it caught all 10 of them by the left foot. Well, they keep the roads open now, and they have school buses. Last summer, they spent $150,000 for school buses so the kids wouldn't have to walk. And now they want to raise $5 million to build a gymnasium so the kids will get some exercise. In our little school, it looked abandoned, and it is. They call it consolidation. We call it stealing. They took our school and it gave it to another town 15 miles away. So they do have a school bus, understand, but a lot of time the boys, and they have snowmobiles and they ride, because there's a beautiful, totally abandoned road, goes over a mountain pass right through the wilderness down to the school, 15 miles each way. And they do have snow. When I was a kid, the thing I wanted more than anything in the world was a flexible flyer sled. It was in Sears catalog, and you could steer it. And it cost $4.99. It might as well cost $5,000. Needless to say, but before I finally got enough money to buy it, I was so old I didn't want it. So when my boys wanted a snowmobile, I mortgaged the whole outfit and bought them one. Right smack then. They were so little they could. And my dad built us a sled, but you couldn't steer it, and it worried Mother. And then when the snow left, they would drive to school. This is the old Model T. Remember you saw a film one time with a house on it? It's the same old truck. People driving behind didn't think there was anybody driving. Part of the time there wasn't. Michael almost became a single-parent child. He just about creamed the old man. My brother went to college, majored in many things. He majored in trailer hitches. That was one thing he really majored in. What we're going to do now, we're going to go to eastern Montana, to the Dakota-Montana line. We're going to find the Missouri River, and we're going to come back on it on the trail of Lewis and Clark. And Montana, a lot of sheep. Sheep is our #5 industry. Well, the sheep aren't, the wool is, but the sheep are one of the steps in the wool gathering. Well, you knew that. You get wool from the sheep, except like my brother said. See, he majored in engineering, too, and he said you get steel wool from a hydraulic ram. Here's the old sheep herder. He had just been telling us he's having trouble with a grizzly bear, and doggone if it didn't come down up on the timber, right on the edge of the timber. They often call him a silver tip. And if you notice the hair, and they're kind of a silver, you know. Well, he gets a sheep now and then, all right. Now, we're in eastern Montana, and my brother, who majored in navigation, is now going to find the Missouri River. He's looking for it up here on the ridge, which kind of startled me. Well, he's majored for 69 years. Every time we've had an argument, he said, well, I ought to know I majored in that. Anything, no matter what it is. And we went across on a little old free ferry. You don't see many of those anymore, do you? You have to get the old farmer, but he doesn't charge you. He likes the company, he said. You know, I was standing at the Art Institute in Phoenix, and they had some of the old Dutch... some of the old Dutch masters there on display. And a couple ladies behind me, one of them say, Maya, would you look at that Van Gogh? And I thought, she's never even seen the film. How did she know? It's the Missouri, about on the Dakota-Montana line. Lewis and Clark came past this point about the middle of May in the year of 1805. Spring, high water, and the water kind of muddy in high water. When it's like that, the old-timers say that it's too thick to drink and too thin to plow. You know, Lewis and Clark were very different. Clark was very much military, had great discipline, which they needed. Lewis was a dreamer. He loved flowers and the birds and the wild things and the plants. He was tough as rawhide, but he often lived in kind of a fantasy world. And he told about the pelican. First time I knew we had pelican in Montana was when I read the Journal of Lewis and Clark. Great reading if you're interested in history, the Journals of Lewis and Clark. And when one takes off, the neighbors all duck, or else they get their hair parted on the wrong side. Duck, you guys. I don't know how many, but many, many. Dennis was impressed. He told me, he said there's thousands and thousands, maybe 500. And on the same island, sharing the same land, it's an island in the Missouri River in eastern Montana, are the great blue heron nests there too. And these are baby blue heron. They were almost exterminated once, they're protected now, so they have a chance at adulthood. Well, Dennis and I were going west on the Missouri towards evening, and we came to a rock they used to call Buffalo Rock, the Indians did, because in the old days, the Indians would climb to the top of that pointy-headed rock, and from that vantage point, they could scan the surrounding prairies, searching for the buffalo. The life of the Indian and the buffalo were closely interwoven. Their entire lifestyle, their food, their teepees, their boats, you know, their boats were willow. They were round. Willow frame covered with buffalo hide, their clothing, their moccasin, the bones, they made their tools and their weapons. And the food, a lot of their food, you heard the word pemmican, with dried buffalo meat pounded with dried berries or dried roots. It was palatable, it was nutritious, and it was preservable. And they put it up by many tons for the hard winters. Now this is a cow and a bull, and a good shot actually. They both have horns, folks, but the cow is bull is a much larger, massive animal. And we're going through here in the mating season, and they fight. That's what the fighting's all about. But unlike the elk, now a bull elk or a buck deer or a bull caribou form a harem of cows. They stake out an area and drive all the other males out of it. But the buffalo does not. They fight over one cow, and they're far more monogamous. This is a plan of nature. We have a science we call eugenics that tells us, you know, that stronger parentage creates stronger offspring. Nature's known that. So in nature's plan, you have to kind of run an obstacle course before you are permitted to sire the next generation. Well, while I was filming that, a coyote went by looking for mice. In spite of all the stories you hear, they live off mice more than anything else. And when they see one, they jump about 5 feet up in the air so they can see him down through the grass. He doesn't do it, but I did want him to. So I followed him and lost track of how far I went, and I heard a rumble behind me. I turned around, and this is what they call a loner, an old bull driven from the herd by the younger ones. And we're having kind of a Mexican standoff right here. I don't know. Why didn't I run? Because I don't run very fast anymore, and the closest tree was in Canada. That's why I didn't run. So I simply stood there, hoping he would think I was a tree. And I think he did. And if he did, he must have thought I was a quaking aspen, because they're a tough animal with a thick hide. But you know, they were unable to make the switch from the prairies. When the prairies were taken over for farmers and ranchers, the buffalo went into oblivion. But the elk and the grizzly bear moved to the mountains. And the grizzly bear is an animal of the Great Plains. Lewis and Clark saw many of them. In fact, Lewis gave them the name we call them. He called them a grizzled bear. We call them a grizzly. But they are doomed now. They're disappearing each year, and fewer. The problem they have with man is that they fight for their space. An attribute we found very positive in ourselves, we find totally intolerable in many wild animals. I love to sleep along this river. I mean, people say, how do you sleep on the hard ground? You paddle a canoe against the current 12 hours. Then you could sleep leaning against a cactus. I mean, it kind of lulls you to sleep. It kind of murmurs its way through the darkness. And the Indians have a legend. They say the whispering of the Missouri River through the night are the voices of their loved ones that are drowned in the river, speaking to them now from the spirit world. Lewis and Clark called this the White Rock area. They went through it for 30 days, as indeed did Dennis Nye. White rocks 600-700 feet high. Clark, being a military man, mentioned what a great natural fortification they would be against an enemy approaching by water. And it was in here that Dennis Nye found the only animated Indian pictographs ever found. We're very, very proud of them. Dennis majored in that. These are bank swallows, and they're almost an invulnerable habitat. They're right above the river. Nothing can get to them. There were many of them. They chatter away very. We saw 5 bull elk. I started filming, and this happens once in a wildlife photographer's lifetime. They went up and skylined all 5 of them. Each one is a royal. To be a royal, you have to have 7 or more points. Have to be an elk to start with. I mean, well, I see everybody rubbing their forehead, no chance. I loved it. It's such a proud animal, isn't it? The elk hold that massive rock. Well, now every time they came to a major river, they had to go to the end of it. And they went up, Lewis and 5 men went up one called the Marias. He thought it might take him through the Rockies to the Pacific. They knew nothing about the land, really. It didn't. It took him to a beautiful lake in Canada, Alberta, Canada. This is Waterton. Waterton Lakes National Park, folks. Delightful suggestion for a Western vacation. I mean, not crowded and beautiful area. The Rockies and wild things and all the things that, and you can, if you want to, walk right from Waterton in Alberta. It sits right on the border with Montana, and you cross on this trail right out of Canada into Glacier Park here in Montana. And the trail, it runs in what we call an alpine world. Most of the trail is over 5,000-6,000 feet. Some of it goes up to 8,000 and 9,000. A world, a massive wildflower garden. And all the colors, just like a great rainbow, had settled softly over the mountains. We're going along up there, and we came to a political dinner. And this was a candidate. And when he had finished eating, he stood up. And he's against raising taxes, I can tell you that. He mentioned that, no tax raises, he said about 4 times. And then he said, read my lips. They really have, you know, I love the things that live up there. I envy them in a sense too. But they, like the Rocky Mountain sheep, this is a lady, a ewe, and look at her world. Look where she looks out. What a life, right? Every which direction is just. But you know, they have little dramas too. Right after I took that, kind of a sad thing happened. Her boyfriend, great, big, beautiful ram, was chasing her. And she ran over to the edge of that cliff. Then she turned around very quickly and ran back. And poor old Romeo had built up so much enthusiasm, he couldn't even turn or stop either one. He did. He went slipping, sliding right over the edge of that son of a gun cliff. Holy Toledo. Talk about a switch in plans. He was really upset. He was. He's still muttering to himself when he went sailing past me. Doggone, he said, I never saw that U-turn. It's the Going to the Sun Highway in Glacier Park. Hangs on the mountain over there. It's a lovely park, and you can ride through the prettiest part. If you're like I am and not hiking that much anymore, you can ride. It's pagan Indian country. The pagans lived in the Northern Rockies, had many beautiful legends, and one of them is this. This is called the Weeping Wall. That was their name for it. And the legend, well, it had a pretty girl, of course, a beautiful Indian girl, much in love with a childhood sweetheart, a warrior, who went to battle and was killed. And when she heard this news, she came to the mountain and jumped over this cliff to her death. And since the mountain had a part in this tragedy, it cries, so the pagans say, to this very day, the Weeping Wall. And there's a beautiful falls, a natural rock formation, and you'll love the name. You know what they call it? The Silver Stairs. Isn't that pretty for that waterfall? The Silver Stairs. I love that. Well, then Lewis and his people came back down the Marias, realizing there was no pass there, and came west on the Missouri with Clark and the others till they came to the Great Swamp. They spent several days here with the yellow-headed blackbirds and red-winged blackbirds and all the wonderful things that live in our wetlands. But the star performers here was a western duck they call a western grebe, and the little boy grebes are going to do a courtship dance. Now, what fires a little boy grebe up is when a little girl grebe, like this one, goes down to the bottom of the pond and comes up with that absolutely ridiculous mouthful of weeds. Yes. When a little boy grebe sees that, it really lights his fire, you know. He plain loses it, he does. And there's a whole stupid swamp full of little boy grebes running around. Folks, anytime you see the male of the species running around like an idiot and making a total fool of himself, you had better believe there's a woman somewhere in the background. Because normally they're a very sober-sided little duck, and what sets them off on this stupidity is that little girl grebe and that stupid mouthful of grass. Well, I know, it sounds like a nutty way to get a thing going for you, but boy, if you haven't tried it, don't knock it, because it sure turned the corner for that old girl, I'll tell you. Now, there's a whole heck slew of them doing it, but she chooses a winner out of all that mishmash, and whom she immediately pulls in off the floor and puts to building a nest. And when the nest is finished, guess who sits on that sucker? Old Twinkle Toes himself. That's who. You're gonna dance, you're gonna pay the fiddler somewhere down the line. And he sits there now watching his buddies still having a ball. And I imagine he must watch this with at least a degree of mixed emotion. Folks, we're going to have a brief intermission. We'll be back shortly with part 2. Thank you. Thank you. You folks know there's 2 gates to heaven. Well, there's the Golden Gate, and we know about. But there's another little gate down the wall, not a very conspicuous gate, and not much used. The cobwebs growing on it. But over both gates, there's a sign. And over the big gate, it says, "Enter here, all men who are dominated by their wives." And over the little gate, it says, "Enter here, all men who are not dominated by their wives." St. Peter went out This morning, long line of men in front of the big gate, which is normal. But this morning, there was a guy standing in front of the other gate. It was so seldom he saw anybody stand there that he went over and he asked him, he said, how come you're standing here? And the guy thought a moment. Well, he said, I don't know. He said, my wife told me to stand here. So, I'm not telling any more wife driving jokes. You'll notice that. I got in trouble last time. Oh, boy. It's too bad. I promised her I wouldn't, because, boy, I tell you, she went to Missoula the other day. We live 90 miles from Missoula. That's one reason I live in DeVore, just 90 miles to a shopping center. Because she loves to shop for clothes. She's got nothing to wear and 5 closets to keep it in. I think as a little girl, she was frightened by an empty clothes hanger. At any rate, she went in Missoula, and first thing she did, she ran through 3 red lights, 2 of them on the back end of a truck. Then she got home. She called me on a different trip that it was. She said, well, she was in town today and I had a collision with a man. But she said, I don't think that I'm in trouble because he had been drinking. So I called up the traffic commissioner in Missoula there in charge of accidents. I never met him, but we speak often. Well, Koofy said it was, I guess, a collision. Yeah, he said the other guy wasn't even in his car. What a collision. But he was drinking, so I don't know what'll come of it. Well, he was drinking, but he was on his own back porch, too. I mean, she had to jump a curb and knock down the fence and climb a set of stairs. Crying out loud. And going home then, she got picked up in a little old nothing town for speeding by the local cop. Picked her up for going 30 miles an hour in a 25-mile zone, which is calling it pretty close. I don't see why. Well, I do. I think the reason he noticed her that she was in reverse. And he had to catch her. And he had to catch her in reverse, too. I mean, yeah, it was a heck of a car chase. Hollywood should have it. He got alongside, and he looked over at her. He said, pull over. So she pulled over, and he fined her $25. And she gave him a check. But she doesn't want me to know with these things. But so on the check stub, she put 1 pullover, $25. Old Grandpa, I kid him a lot, but I really terribly fond of him, and I admired him because he never quit trying. Now, he never succeeded either, but, you know, I mean, it takes more guts to keep trying when you're losing. I mean, if you know you're going to make a bundle that day, it's pretty easy to get out of bed, but when you know you're going to get beat up that day, it's kind of, at any rate, but he did finally, and his memory kind of went down like mine has, you know, and Dennis and I were going to school one time. We had to walk to school, 4 miles to school. I guess I told you. I might have told you 3 miles. It gets longer as the evening goes long. And there was Grandpa was on the trail. And he was in his 80s, but he used to get up early, and he had a rope in his hand. It lay there about 20 feet, wasn't tied on anything. He had one in his hand just laying there. And he'd look at it, and then he'd shake his head. And I saw he was worrying. So Grandpa, he said, what's the problem? He said, I can't remember whether I found a rope or lost a cow. He had a lot of problems with cows in his older age. He kind of kept track of the cow. We had a few cows, you know, and it was his job to go get them, and they always wandered to the farthest corner of we had 600 acres, and poor old guy, one day, cow got away, went down the gravel county road, and he went after it. And a truck came along. He was leading it home with a rope. And a truck came along and hit him. Both of them knocked him in the ditch. And eventually Grandpa sued the truck driver. First time he ever sued anybody. And I remember we all went to Superior, Montana. That's where the courthouse was. We went on the steam train, and it was a big expedition for us. We saw electric lights and running water, first time we'd seen it. And we had the trial, and the judge asked Grandpa, he said, you've told two stories. When this man hit you and your cow, he said he asked you how you were. If you were hurt, how you were. And you said that you were fine, just fine. Now, he says, you come back and tell us that you got a bad back. He said, what's the story here? Well, Judge, Grandpa said, he said, I was leading old Daisy down the road. Truck come along, hits both of us, knocks us in the ditch. We're laying in the ditch. Truck driver come running back. He stops, looks at the cow, and he says, how's the cow? I said, she got a broken leg. And he pulled out a gun and shot her. You're way ahead of me, I know that. Then he comes over to me. He says, how are you? Grandpa said, I'm fine, just fine. Well, at any rate, that's kind of now, what we're going to do now is go on Lewis and Clark Trail as we are. Now, Lewis and Clark eventually came to the head of the Missouri, and there's a waterfall there and a little lake. And now they could go back home. Indeed, the crew thought they were going back home. 20 men on the edge of mutiny. They were poorly fed. Ahead lay some grim mountains they'd heard terrible stories about, and winter was ahead. They hadn't seen their families in over 2 years, hadn't had any word from anybody. One of their men had died, and they'd buried him, and they were eating anything they could eat, and winter was coming. They were anxious to get going, and they were jubilant tonight because they were going home in the morning, start home. And at 4:30 in the morning, Lewis and Clark made what was a tough decision, not to go back, but to go on west and make a claim to the nation. Just imagine telling the crew that. They had to do it, too. I mean, it wasn't easy. They were tough guys. And so if you want to turn out the lights, yeah, I won't kid my brother anymore. Well, as Lewis and Clark went west now, they came to the present-day site of one of the largest cities in Montana. This is Great Falls, Montana, straddling the Missouri River. It was a very important river city in the American West because it was near the head of navigation on the Missouri River system. Just down the river a little ways is the Great Falls, and this, of course, stopped navigation. However, you could come all the way from New Orleans to here without any man-made navigational aids with the old shallow draft stern wheel riverboats of the time. And then from here, they built a road. It was called the Mullen Road, and it went 600 miles through the Rockies to connect the head of navigation on the Great Falls here, the head of navigation on the Missouri at Great Falls. It connected with the head of navigation on the Columbia at Walla Walla, Washington. This was Charlie Russell country, working cowboy and a talented artist. In the early years, he painted many an original for a room in a cheap hotel in Great Falls. And then a picture he drew changed his life. In the winter of 1887, he was in charge of 5,000 head of cattle in eastern Montana, and they had a terrible blizzard, covered much of the whole Montana. Thousands of cattle died. And the owner of that herd was in Chicago, and he heard about this storm, and he sent Charlie Russell a telegram. And on it, it simply said, please wire condition of herd. Well, Russell eventually got that telegram, and he turned it over, and he drew a line drawing that was about to change his life. It was one starving steer in a blizzard surrounded by wolves. And underneath it, he wrote a single line, last of the 5,000. When the man got the telegram, he knew the herd was gone. But he knew whoever drew that drawing, with its poignancy and its message, should not be herding cattle. And he did very little of it after that. The picture is now unpurchasable. The original, they won't even want to sell at any price. He became wealthy from his artistry later on. Well, we are a cattle country and horses, and last year is one of the events of our 100th birthday. We had the last of the great cattle drives, over 3,100 head of cattle, many of them Texas Longhorns, and they drove them for days right across the open prairie and the mountains. And they had to have men to drive them. Not everybody can drive cattle. A man that drives them, I didn't know this either. It's a specialized cowboy activity. They're called drovers, and they'd had to have experience. This man had experience. We know him slightly better now, and he had to pick out 4 of his best horses. Every driver, every drover had to bring 4 horses, and the horses traveled by themselves just along with the cattle drive in what they call a remuda, and that's the old Spanish word for a herd of horses. But this is the cattle drive, and notice they're going right out across the open range, folks, and it's just like it was. You could just let your mind slip back so easily 100 or 140 years. I mean, it's a walk back into history. And our cattle brand, you'll see on some of them, it's an M with an 89 under it. I don't specifically know just where, but I have a close of it. That's our Montana Centennial. And they brought them, the first cattle drives to come to Montana came from the south, from Texas. See, the range, their feed would dry up in Texas long before it would in Montana. And then they would come to the high, there's the cattle brand. They would come to the tall, sweet grass of Montana to fatten them up. And their Texas Longhorns, even here. Lonesomest cowboy job is what they call a night rider. Even when the others were coming in and the cattle were standing still, a couple of men had to ride the herd at night in case of a lightning storm or thunder, you know. And they never saw anybody all night out there. Maybe 2 men on a herd that ran several miles around the perimeter. And they got so they could tell when the cattle grew uneasy. A clap of thunder might start a stampede, you know. So when they noticed an owl hoot or a coyote howl and a little uneasiness in the herd, they detected that. What they found would help is if they sang a song, kind of a low-key, conservative, a very soothing type of music, and that would calm the cattle. And many of the cowboy songs that went on, some are still with us today, were born with some old lonesome night rider whiling away the darkness hours till daylight. And I would love to watch him work with cattle. If you ever watch a good sheepdog work with sheep, well, same thing with a good cow horse. Not any horse can do it. Not any cowboy can either. They never touch the animal. But when word spread that they were going to have the last great cattle drive, they had literally thousands of applications that volunteered to drive the cattle from Australia, New Zealand, and Bulgaria, and Russia, and China, and all over the world. Indeed, 3,000 people came and rode behind it, well behind it, but at least they were a part of the last cattle drive. Don't see the cattle anymore. That was part of our centennial. But you do see lots of wild animals all along the Missouri. It goes right through a wilderness. You know, no highway ever really followed Lewis and Clark's Missouri Trail. Parts of it, but in its entirety, it's mostly wilderness. Saw lots of antelope. That's a pronghorn buck. Fastest living thing in the Western Hemisphere. Only 3 animals in the world that are faster. One is a cat, the cheetah in Africa. Saw lots of deer, too, hundreds of deer. See, they come down to the river and drink. The nice thing about a wooden canoe is very quiet. You hit a wooden canoe with a paddle, it's wood on wood, a sound of nature. You don't frighten things. It's a herd of bucks, and the one is the acknowledged leader as far as the deer are concerned. But he's not king of the mountain. He changed his course by 90 degrees. Don't ever try to out-jump a rattlesnake. Many a mornings, my brother cooks breakfast, and his cooking is enough to make a man wish he had lockjaw. But he'd be cooking, and I'd go up, and I'd hear this booming sound. It's a prairie cock, and what he's doing is letting all the prairie hens know that he's up and that he's available, and he's sending out messages like crazy, you know. And this was another courtship dance of the sharp-tailed grouse. And here, once again, I want you to notice something. Once again, anytime you see the male of the species going around, sticking his neck out, stamping his feet, or trying to walk on water, generally making a darn fool of himself, you better believe there's a woman involved. And she walks across, and she's causing all this, and they're just knocking themselves out for her. She doesn't even give them the time of day. She's here in a moment, her snoot in the air. She doesn't even, and every time they'd slow down, she'd walk by again and fire them up. There she goes, Miss Snoot in the sky. I hope she steps in a badger hole. Well, I felt sorry for this guy, because I bonded with him. He got turned down every time. And I did too. I was 44 before I got married. And Lord knows I was trying. I had turned down more times than a bedspread. And I was jumping up in the air and yelling at him. It's a wonder I didn't get a technical. I was trying to coach him, you know. And then I had to leave, and I worried about him. I went back months later to see how he's doing. Yeah. Look at her run. Look at her run. I hope a coyote catches her. I really do. Oh, he was no quitter. It was snow on the ground. He's wearing snowshoes, but he's still in there trying. I admire that. And then one day, a marvelous thing almost happened. One accepted him. Look at this. She just stood there waiting for him, and then his mind went total blank. Do something, you idiot. I mean, she stood there about 5 minutes. And boy, she walked away. She was talking to herself. She says, you men are all alike. All smoke and no fire. Now Lewis and Clark came to the Big Belt Mountains in central Montana. The rivers cut a notch through them, and Lewis and Clark named this the Gates of the Mountains. And here's the story about a birth of a city. After the Civil War, they found gold in central Montana here, and many men came from the south, Confederate soldiers. 4 came from Alabama, spent several years prospecting, found a little gold, but not really much. Every fall, they'd start home, and then they'd talk themselves out of it, try again. This year, they all decided, and so they started walking, and they walked for several days. It was a long ways to Great Falls to get on the riverboats to go back to the deep south. They came to this little creek one night, not far now from the river. And they camped, and the next morning they looked at it. Boy, they said it looked like there'd be gold in that creek. Oh, heck, they said, let's give it one last chance. And they did, and by night they were all potentially wealthy. And by night a city had been born. Our capital city in Montana, Helena, Montana. When the word of the gold strike, people came in and they built their businesses right along the street. I mean, the saloons and the bars and the restaurants and the brothels and all the things that went. And they built them, and of course they named the street Last Chance Gulch. Last Chance Gulch is still the main street of Montana's capital city. And as recently as last summer before last, they built a mall. Last Chance Mall along it, and all the wonderful, Nevada City reminded me so much of it when I saw it the other night. And right where he found the gold that morning, a couple of metal miners and an old gold rocker. The story of the birth of our capital city, Helena, Montana. Now farther on they come where the little town of Three Forks is now. They sent one of their men, John Coulter, south into what is now Wyoming. Then he turned west. He was trying to find a smoother route to the Pacific Ocean. For a man looking for a smoother route, he was picking in pretty poor cotton. He ran right into the Tetons. Now the Tetons are part of the Rockies, but one of the ruggedest stretches. He immediately realized that this was nothing that they could handle, so he started going right back north. He was in Jackson Hole, western Wyoming, and the Tetons. Eventually it became Teton National Park, and he went north from them to rejoin the party, and of course ran into Yellowstone National Park. And he told Lewis and Clark he went up on a huge river, and on the side of this cold river were boiling hot springs and steam and colored mud leaping in the air. And right in the river, he said, where it was 7 foot deep, steam, warm even when it got to the surface. He was floating down the Yellowstone River, and thanks to the fact that somebody later on set it aside as a wilderness, you can do the same, see the same he saw then. I mean, it's still pretty much as Coulter saw it. And folks, if it were not a national park, that would simply not be the case. It wouldn't be there, the buffalo and all. I mean, he told about building a raft and floating on the raft and the buffalo bumping into them. And do the day, and the big ones, the male swims downstream from the female because they're taller and longer legs. And if you're washed downstream, it's simply a very terminal experience because just downstream is a terrible waterfall. You can swim, you can fish though, trout fish. The limit is 4 trout or 2 buffalo. But such a peaceful, tranquil river, for so long it lulls you, and then it just goes berserk and leaps over the edge of the world. It's the upper falls of the Yellowstone. It crashes with a roar for miles into a canyon of its own creation. The Yellowstone Canyon, one of the deepest in North America. and it got its name from the Indians. The Indians never went there a lot because they thought it was a home of the evil spirits, but they knew well about the canyon, and they saw the yellow rocks that you're seeing there, and their Indian words for this meant simply that, yellow rock or yellow stone. Now there's another falls there. We saw the upper, this is the lower, about 2 miles down the river, and then there are all sorts of littler creeks tumble in. Some fall for hundreds of feet. One of them is a little falls called Tower Falls, and I was filming it. And it was a pretty falls. It was enough to make a picture. But before I started filming, I just ready to start, a bird called a western tanager flew in and lit there after I was set up. And boy, did he ever improve the picture. Isn't that a fabulous thing? Birds like pretty things. I've often noted birds. I'll be watching the bird, but they'll be watching, you know, a river, waterfall, sunset. I think they enjoy. Well, the Indians had reason to be suspicious. It does look like the home of evil spirits. The steam comes from, and it colors things, all different colors, and it looks kind of evil. And it smells kind of evil too, because it's sulfur, you know. Lots of geysers. And one day I was out taking pictures. I came back, and Dennis had our lunch table set up right in the middle. There was a big sign, 2 of them, said, "Keep out geyser basin." And here he was. And I told him, Dennis, I said, there's a sign there that says, geyser basin. I said, maybe we better get out. No, he said, geyser basin's one of the things he'd majored in, and one of those fathead colleges he went to, and this, he said, was not. We had a terrible fire in Yellowstone Park 2 years ago, and not only a bad fire, but a very controversial fire. It started 3 small fires. We're about 95% certain now that it was started by man, an arson fire. Now, men start fires, people start fires accidentally, but we think these were started on purpose. They were started in very dry, hot weather, windy weather. But they were detected quickly and could have been readily put out with the equipment available there. They were not put out because they were not fought, and they were not fought because it was park policy not to fight a forest fire within the park limits. And folks, believe me, I can't badmouth them because I favored that policy myself. I do not any longer. But the reasoning is good. They want to keep the parks just as natural, just as free from man-made regulations as they possibly can. That's the whole concept. And I admire that. But there are metes and bounds. And the reason they thought they wouldn't have to fight it is because when we first came here, the land lay, the forest lay across the land like a great carpet for tens of thousands of square miles. And yet there'd never been fought by man. So their conclusion was that the forest, the nature, could handle its own fires. The fallacy in that theory is that before man was here to before man was here to fight the fires, man was also not here to start the fires. Now, nature does start it with lightning, but the integral part of a lightning storm is the deluge, the downpour, the cloudburst that follows. Most of these fires are rained out. Certainly they're dampened down. Man works the other end of the weather spectrum and starts them at their most potentially dangerous time. So we just simply have to, you know, whatever, eat crow, whatever you want to call it, say we were wrong. A lot of people were wrong on that theory, and start fighting them, because people will start them occasionally. And the real victim, of course, is so often the things that live in the forest. And they did play down, I think they played down the damage. I heard one talk in a group there where they said only 7 elk were killed in the fire. Well, maybe only 7 died as a direct result of the fire, but folks, many more were killed later, because the biggest danger to our wild kingdom, in the park, out of the park, furred, feathered, or crawling, the biggest danger to all of them is loss of habitat. And here, a great percentage of their habitat was destroyed, particularly that they use in the wintertime. So when winter came, they went to their normal habitat and found no food. So then, many for the first time in their life stepped out of the sanctity, the safety, across the boundary, out of the park. And this had been anticipated by some people that this would happen, and they were killed in great numbers. and still are to a certain degree now, although lessening each day. There's another bird looking at a pretty sight with a Clark's nutcracker looking at Gibbons Falls. If you were going to go to the park, or if you had ever had that even in your potential plans, don't change because of the fire. I mean, there's a lot of park that wasn't touched and it's still a beautiful place to go, like Morning Glory Pool, and Old Faithful Geyser. Did you know that Old Faithful is not the biggest in the park? One called Steamboat is much bigger. There are several that are bigger, but this is the most beloved, the most famous, because it's always been there pretty much when it said it would. I think that's comforting for a lot of people. I mean, most of us, if we're ever going to have any chance at fame or even great respect, we can't get it by throwing a football half a mile, because we can't do that. We got to get it the same way the Geyser did, simply by always being there and doing the best we could when we said we would. The boys and I floated the river last year, Madison. It heads up in the park, trout stream. I like fishing. I wanted them to learn, and whether they liked it or not, and both do. See, fishing gives you an excuse to be in a beautiful place. I mean, you just go stand by a creek and look at it for about 4 hours, somebody will arrest you. That's suspicious, right? You put a fish pole in your hand, you can stand there all week. You're socially acceptable. This river goes right along one of the most famous of the buffalo jumps, a great cliff called the Madison Buffalo Jump. And in the old days, the Indians, before they had the rifle, still used buffalo. They even used them before they had the horse. Spain brought the horse. And that's the buffalo jump you see. It runs for miles. They drove them over the edge. They killed themselves when they hit that steep ground and slid right down to the edge of the river, which was the highway of that time. The Indians dressed them, smoked them, and dried the meat, loaded it into their round. Did I tell you their boats were round primarily, made out of willow frame and covered with buffalo hide? They loaded the meat in there and floated it hundreds of miles to their camps, sometimes hundreds of miles. See, they had to have a lot in the winter. And they put it up. One Army report tells how they drove away the Indians from a camp and later destroyed 50 tons of pemmican they found stored 2 big teepees full. So they put a lot of it up for the hard winter. There was a lot of friction, of course, between the Indians who had been here, a reasoning, thinking people for hundreds of years, and ourselves. We never did admit their ownership to it, and this allowed us, of course, to do a lot of things that our morality would not have allowed otherwise, like kill them. And the wars, this was the most famous battle, for years called the Custer Battle, now called the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But this is where it was fought, folks, right here. General Custer and the entire 7th Cavalry were killed here in a 2-hour battle with the various tribes. It wasn't just the Sioux. It was the Sioux and the Minnetonka and the Mandan and the Shoshone. A lot of Indians involved in this battle. Custer was last seen alive here, about halfway from where he died, I'll show you in a moment, to the trees on Little Bighorn. Where he was last seen about halfway, that's where the Indian camp was that morning. Here's where he died with the remainder of the 7th Cavalry. And after this battle, the Indians, pretty much led by a man named Sitting Bull. He was not a warrior. He wasn't a chief either. He was a great organizer. He took the Indians and they went to Canada, to the land they call the land of the Redcoat, where their descendants are still today, primarily in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Further west we come to what was the second territorial capital and the first state capital, Virginia City. It's a gold town. A creek ran right through it, and you could get gold out of Alder Creek. You couldn't get it out of the country. You had to carry it overland 120 miles, once again, to get on the river boats to go east or south to home with your gold. And the bandits held you up, stole your gold, and often people were killed. Now, the gold was of such a significant amount that it attracted big-time crooks, and eventually the crooks took over the law. The lawless became the law. This does happen, you know. I mean, the judge was crooked, the juries were crooked, the sheriff was crooked. Henry Plummer, they elected him to get rid of the road agents. Heck, he was the leader of the road agents. So the people got together, the vigilantes, and they came from California. That's where we got the idea, from your gold rush. And they met here and they formed the vigilantes, and there were 5 exposed rafters. The next morning they arrested 5 of the road agent gangs, including 2 deputy sheriffs. They hanged all 5 of them there, and they buried them 1 block off the main street on a little hill here. They buried him with their boots on, and to this day they call it Boot Hill. But you know, they called themselves the Montana Vigilance Committee, and it was a case where the law and order had been taken over by the crime syndicate of the time. We had organized crime at that time. But the sheriff wasn't there that morning, and he was in Bannock. This is Bannock. Bannock was our first territorial capital, and the posse rode that night, a cold January night, over 50 miles through the frozen hills to get to the sheriff before his friends got to him. And they did. He was still in bed. They got there in the very early light of dawn, and they arrested him and 2 more road agents with him in his house. They built a gallows right in his front yard, and they hanged all 3 and buried them there in the sheriff's front yard. Before it was over, they had hanged, over a period of time and space, over 70 that were involved in the road agent gang. The Montana Vigilantes, an offshoot of your own California Vigilantes, who did the same thing to bring law and order to parts of the gold rush country here. The Garden, well, it's a little farm. We're going west now on the Missouri, of course. Came to that lovely garden, and this is the Olson Farm. See, I show you big wheat fields and all, and big cattle spreads. An awful lot of our farming is still littler farms, although they're becoming less and less as the land is purchased by bigger buyers. But this is a man and his wife. They have 40 acres, and they raise some hay, and they sell milk. They have 40 head of cows, and that was the man. His wife would run the mowing machine, and the boys, 7 and 12, were running hay rakes. And, you know, the farmer gets a lot of kidding as being a poor mechanic. Heck, they dreamed up a lot of the things that they use now. I mean, the first stacker, the first front end lift, anything I ever saw was on front of an old Model A Ford truck a neighbor built. Pretty crude, but it beat a pitchfork 7 ways, I'll tell you. Well, at any rate, the Missouri River now is coming out of the Rockies. And of course, here Lewis and Clark saw the wildest water they had ever seen. And indeed, they were towing their boats with long ropes called lining, and the rope broke, the boat got away, went over a waterfall, maybe that one, and they got the boat back, but everything on it was lost. Most importantly, their medicine chest, and most importantly, the medicine they lost, quinine. Quinine was a miracle drug of that age, and the men ran fevers, and the quinine was imperative, and they lost it. They were 2 years in the wilderness. It was a real problem, and that night, an 18-year-old Indian girl named Sacagawea came to Lewis and Clark. She was not a guide, but in the land of the Dakotas, the tribe called the Dakotas, they had hired a guide, Charbonneau, to lead him to the Pacific. He would not go unless he could take his wife. They didn't want her, but to get him, they took her. He turned out to be pretty worthless. She turned out to be a godsend. She went to them that troubled night after the boat was lost, tipped over. She told him, she said, I know of a flower, the root of which will cure your men. Neither one believed her, but finally the next morning, having little choice, they followed her for several hours. See, she was a Shoshone Indian. This was her birthplace. She knew this. She had been captured by the Dakotas. And they followed her up on a ridge and found the flower, the bitter root. Remember, you saw it earlier? And the men ate the root, and the fever went away. Lovely lady. She crawled in a cave and gave birth to a baby boy. Not even her worthless husband stayed with her. They were afraid she couldn't keep up. She not only did that, she caught up with them 8 days later and carried the little guy all the way to the ocean and back. At any rate, folks, I live in western Montana. It's timber country. And when I was a kid, and a lot of you kind of did what was there to do where you were. I mean, if you were born in Kansas, you were a wheat farmer. If you're born in the Appalachians, you were a coal miner. If you're born in western Montana, you were a logger. I went to work full-time in the logging camps when I was 14. And we logged. I started falling with a crosscut saw and skidding with horses. And now they fall them and pick them straight up. It's a great way to log. It doesn't mess up the forest. I'm 100% in favor of it. Helicopter logging. Yeah, Dad had my dad was a hard man, very pragmatic, had a hard life. So I never got much schooling, really. He used to say going to school never hurt anybody, as long as it didn't interfere with their education. Yeah. I never went to school much. I know that seems impossible when you hear me now, but spelling. I couldn't get spelling. One time in a spelling bee, I spelled weather with 4 H's. Teacher said it was the worst spell of weather she'd ever seen. Now the logs are carried then. See, you don't have to build a road. You don't tear up the world. You lift them straight up, and then you do take them to a landing, and you truck them out of there. You can always get a job driving logging truck. Big turnover among logging truck drivers. We do have a problem in the Northwest now, there's no question. We've clear cut for many years, folks. I didn't like it 50 years ago when I first heard about it. I like it less now looking back at it. It's efficient, but it doesn't show much compassion for another generation. Sooner or later, at the rate we're doing it, we're going to run out of timber. We are really. You don't have to. Norway and Sweden have logged for 1,000 years, but it's just the way you do it. And I'm not bad-mouthing logger. That's what I am. My boys will likely be, and most of my friends are. But anyway, we eat a lot of fish. Eat a lot of fish. My brother cooks the fish. His cooking is enough to make, it's enough to gag a skunk. I tell you, I'm not going to, I want to call your attention to this. This is the very piece of the Missouri, notice how little it is, where Lewis and Clark came on a late August day in 1805. Right up this very river. I like historical things for that reason. Really happened. And about 5 o'clock they came to a little lake on the far side of Waterfall. And they declared that to be the very headwaters of the great Missouri River. It's over 2,800 miles from New Orleans. And they claimed everything between here and there, right of purchase from France, $15 million. And then at that point, they could, have turned around and went back. Jefferson told them they'll be welcomed as heroes. But then he told them how bad they needed a route west and a claim. So they kept going west. But they sat on some rocks, Lewis said, till 4:30 in the morning, he and Clark, trying to decide. And listen to the revelry of the crew, he said, thinking they were going to go home the next morning. What a tough assignment to tell them. But they went west on this river. It's a salmon river. Clark had seen salmon, Atlantic salmon, and he saw a very similar fish here and named it the Salmon River. But that's not the river most people call it. It's a wild river. That's my brother shooting the rapids. He missed it 4 times. I thought he was going to run out of bullets. Now, Sacagawea told him, don't go down this river, she told Lewis and Clark, because she said, any of my people that have ever gone down it, none ever came back. And the Indian name, and the one most used by local whites, is called the River of No Return. But somebody had gone down and come back, because she told him, she said it goes through rugged mountains for many moons and empties into a lake so big you cannot see the other shore, and the sun sets in that lake every night and so befouls the water you cannot drink it. Somebody knew about the Pacific Ocean, didn't they? And lived to bring the story back. Well, this was a great time for Lewis, particularly, naturalist and a zoologist. He was now seeing, they'd heard about the animals that lived here in these rugged mountains. Many stories, mostly very grim. Now he was seeing for the first time many totally new animals to him, like the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. And he said they live in a skyline world and look with great disdain upon the inhabitants of the valley below. He named them that morning. In 1805, he called them the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. And he said they do not own that vertical rock. They share it with a magnificent shaggy white animal that also dwells there and that we will call the Rocky Mountain goat. He said in the mornings they look out on one of the prettiest sights in all these rugged mountains. For the fog, he said, lays like great white rivers winding down the valleys. Lewis he was on cloud 9. And I'm glad he was happy because he lived kind of a sad, lonesome life. He never married. He lived a short life, and he was very near the end of it right now. Whenever we'd go down a rapids, which we did a lot of, it seems, we would, one guy would, this where we camped. Dennis picked out a camping spot here, and he majored in that, I'm sure you know. Well, I asked him, I said, is it possible we'd have any problem with rolling rock? No, he said, if it were a falling rock area, there'd be a sign here. Well, what you see are the mountains leveling out and forming lesser valleys. That's how land, given time, becomes less sharp and mountainous and more level. The mountain peaks fall into the valleys. Insidious, but ongoing. And now it was where I was saying one of us would run the rapids, the other guy would go along the edge and keep an eye on the guy that was running them. And I ran most of them, because one of the things my brother majored in was walking around the rapids and keeping an eye on the guy that was going through them. Remarkable, I didn't even know they taught it. But at any rate, I darn near bought the farm right there. The canoe got away and I was too cold. Dennis finally jumped in and hauled me out and let the canoe. We never saw the canoe again. So we start walking, but not up or down the river. That's too tough. Due north of the Salmon River and parallel to it is another river called the Selway. I know because I logged on the Selway and there's a road on it. Before you go into a wilderness like this, you want to have some alternate exits, just like you go into a great big strange building. Check a few exits in case you have to get out. So we start walking due north, just over the mountain, north to the Selway, about 40 miles, I guess, probably over the mountain. And a little porcupine, we had to eat whatever we didn't eat us first, really, I guess. And my brother picked out what he called a dry camp, and we stayed here that night. But it's a good thing that it's a marvelous. Now, this is not winter. What this was, the very day we lost the canoe, it snowed about 1.5 feet in these mountains. It's an early warning storm. You have it every year. Lasts about a week, early September. Then the snow goes away, at least in the valleys. It may stay on the tops. And you have one of the prettiest seasons of the year in the West. We call it Indian summer. And we're coming down the mountain. We've crossed it up where the snow was. We're coming down now and to one of the little lakes I told you about. They're not big, but they're terribly deep. See, they're just as deep as a mountain goes in at that same angle. And an old cowboy was sitting there. He was sitting on his horse. His horse's name is Old Blue, he told us. He was fishing right out of the saddle, you know. But we stayed with him that night, and he cooked a big supper. He told a lot of stories. And then the next day, he took us down. He had two pack horses, and he took us down to this river. This is the Bitterroot River in the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana. One of our largest cities, Missoula, sits on this. Now, Lewis and Clark tried the salmon, had nothing but trouble, like Sacagawea had told them they would. Then they gave up and came over a trail called Lost Trail Pass to the same Bitterroot River. Now, there is now a road, a fairly new highway called the Lewis and Clark Highway that runs right up the Lolo, right up the Bitterroot. And they came up here. It was early September of 1805 when they finally crossed the Continental Divide right here, Lolo Summit. Lewis and Clark party crossed this pass September 13, 1805, westbound for the Pacific. They came down it on an old Nez Perce Indian trail, went down the Locksaw River to the Clearwater to the Snake River, and down the Snake River to the grandfather of all northwestern rivers, the mighty Columbia River itself. And on down the Columbia past Mount Hood, what is now Oregon, stopped 3 days at the second highest waterfall in North America. Lewis named it after a local Indian chief that had befriended his party, Chief Multnomah. And he wrote in his diary on that cold November day, he said, it's rimmed in ice, maybe much the way you see it there. They got back on the river, and on December 5th in the year 1805, came to the ocean here, the mouth of the Columbia, and that day, standing by the lighthouse, where the lighthouse is now, gave us our first valid claim to the West Coast. And Lewis wrote in his diary, I realized a dream of years when I finally saw the sun set in the Western Sea. It was a high moment, but it was also an unhappy moment. They had presumed they would be met by a ship. That was the original arrangement. They would be met by a ship who would take them home and give them word of news and friends and food. He said the men so wanted to see a ship, they imagined they saw one. But he said it was a ghost ship, and really it was an empty sea. The story, Thomas Gray, Captain Thomas Gray, was sent for them. And he anchored here and lay at the mouth of the river 2 months. And he named the river, incidentally, after his ship. The Columbia was the name of the ship. And after 2 months, he concluded the expedition had perished in the wilderness, and he left a little over 2 weeks before they arrived. And he spread the word to the outside world they had perished. Well, they backed up a little. They built a fort, Fort Clatsop. They ran up the flag and gave us our first claim as they raised the flag the first time, officially. Then they came back the same hard, took a year to come back. Their lives separated quickly now. Clark went on to a life of wealth and glory, governor of Missouri. Lewis was shot and killed on a lonely mountain trail in Tennessee at the age of 35. Sacagawea, the little Indian girl, drifted almost immediately into obscurity, lays buried somewhere in the prairies of the West. But folks, decisions they made along these lonely western rivers those many years ago affect the quality of our lives right here in Sierra College tonight more than most of us ever realize. As I remember you over the years, always a delightful audience, and again tonight you were. Thank you. God bless you all, and good night. So, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody. So long.